The silence in the courtroom was unnatural, almost suffocating, as if the heavy wooden walls themselves were holding their breath. Karoline Leavitt stood alone at the plaintiff's table, her notes neatly stacked, her hands steady, her heart beating loud enough that she wondered if others could hear it. The afternoon sun streamed to the tall, dusty windows, casting long, heavy shadows across the room, painting the scene like a portrait of an old war about to erupt once again. Everything about this day had felt wrong from the beginning. She had sensed it when she woke up before dawn, a gnawing unease she couldn't shake off no matter how many times she prayed. But she came anyway. She had made a promise, not just to herself, but to the countless small business owners, workers, and families who have been quietly crushed under the heel of a system that no longer remembered justice. She was here for them, for truth. Judge Roland Mercer entered the courtroom with a swagger that seemed to shake the floorboards. His robe flared behind him like the wings of a vulture. He did not so much as glance at Karoline as he took his seat, slamming his gavel down in a single aggressive thud that echoed like a gunshot. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. The bailiff called the case, his voice mechanical, weary. Karoline rose to speak, introducing herself in a calm, respectful tone. She had barely finished saying her name when Judge Mercer leaned forward, his cold gray eyes narrowing, and pointed a bony finger directly at the cross resting over her heart. "Miss Leavitt," he said, loud enough for every spectator and journalist to hear, "if you think dragging your religious jewelry in here will earn you sympathy, you're even more naive than you look." There was a sharp gasp from the audience, followed by a suffocating stillness. Karoline felt a burning heat climb up her neck, but she kept her expression composed, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "My cross isn't meant to gain sympathy, Your Honor," she said, voice even and firm. "It reminds me to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." The judge's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "Spare me the sermon. This court deals in facts, not fairy tales." He slammed his gavel again, cutting off anything else she might have said. Karoline glanced quickly around the room. She could see the smirks of the corporate lawyers seated across from her, the ones who had spent the past year trying to destroy an innocent bakery owned by a hard-working couple whose only crime was standing by their faith. She knew she was fighting an uphill battle, but she hadn't known, until now, just how rigged the hill really was. Still, she steadied herself, pushing forward. She laid out her argument carefully, weaving constitutional protections into a narrative that even a hostile court should not have been able to ignore. Every word was measured, deliberate, building a case stone by stone. But Judge Mercer interrupted her at every turn, hurling sarcastic remarks, undermining her points, twisting her words into weapons against her. It felt like battling a storm with nothing but a paper shield. At one point, he laughed openly. "Miss Leavitt, you're out of your depth. Frankly, I'm embarrassed for you." She stood frozen for a moment, the insult slicing deeper than she expected. But instead of shrinking, she drew in a slow, steady breath and lifted her chin. "I didn't come here to be comfortable," she said quietly. "I came here to tell the truth." Something flickered in the judge's eyes, a momentary falter, almost imperceptible, like a man suddenly realizing the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. The courtroom door creaked open at the back. Two men in dark suits entered, their presence so unassuming that most people barely noticed. But Karoline noticed. There was a tightness to their movements, a sharp focus in their eyes. They sat silently, pens in hand, observing. She pressed on with her case, even as the judge's attacks grew bolder, even as her own voice sometimes wavered with the weight of it all. Every time Judge Mercer mocked her or belittled her arguments, Karoline responded with calm, quiet strength. She refused to become the monster he tried to make her. The hearing dragged on for what felt like hours. Then, as she was making her final statement, drawing a line from precedent to principle, Judge Mercer slammed his gavel so hard the wood cracked. "Enough," he barked. "This nonsense is over. I'm issuing a summary judgment against you. Case dismissed." Karoline's heart stuttered in her chest. A wave of despair threatened to drag her under. She had done everything right. She had built an airtight case. And yet, here it was, corruption, naked and shameless, wearing the robes of authority. But before she could gather her notes, before she could even move, one of the suited men at the back stood up and spoke. "Judge Mercer," he said, his voice cutting clean through the room like a blade. "You're not dismissing anything. You're under arrest." The courtroom exploded. The other man moved forward, flashing a badge, Department of Justice, Special Investigations Division. Gasps and cries filled the air as the agents approached the bench. Judge Mercer rose, sputtering, his face purple with rage. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "I am a sitting judge. You have no authority." "We have every authority," the agent said coolly, producing a thick folder and dropping it onto the bench. "Wire transfers, falsified court orders, payments from corporate interest groups. You're done, Mercer." Handcuffs gleamed in the afternoon light as they locked around the judge's wrists. The gavel lay forgotten on the floor, a symbol of a power now shattered. Karoline stood frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. Around her, the spectators rose from their seats, their faces a mix of shock, awe, and in some cases, quiet vindication. As Judge Mercer was led away, he twisted his head back toward Karoline. For a fleeting second, their eyes locked. In his, she saw not rage, but fear, raw, naked fear. She offered him no satisfaction. She simply bowed her head in a silent prayer, not for vengeance, but for healing, even for him. The journalist bolted from the room like a pack of hounds unleashed. Flashbulbs exploded as Mercer was shoved into a waiting police car outside. Reporters crowded around Karoline, shouting questions, microphones thrust toward her face. "Karoline, how does it feel to be vindicated? Did you know the judge was corrupt? Are you going to sue?" Karoline raised a hand, quieting them with a simple gesture. Her voice, when it came, was steady and filled with something deeper than triumph, something closer to grace. "I came here today to defend the truth, and the truth defended itself." The crowd fell silent. For one long, breathtaking moment, all the noise of the world seemed to hush, bearing witness to something rare and beautiful. Not just justice, but redemption. As she stepped down the courthouse steps, Karoline felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Not just the weight of this case, but the greater, darker weight. The creeping despair that maybe goodness didn't stand a chance anymore. Today it had, and it would again, because as long as people were willing to stand, even when it cost them everything, there would always be hope. And hope, once awakened, is impossible to silence. The storm outside the courthouse had been gathering strength all afternoon, unnoticed in the frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Thick, gray clouds swirled overhead as if the sky itself was brooding over what had just happened. The first low rumble of thunder echoed as Karoline stepped into the waiting car, her hands still trembling, though she refused to show it. Inside it was quiet, almost too quiet. Her attorney friend, Michael Reyes, sat beside her, his face unreadable. He had been one of the few who believed in her from the beginning, who hadn't begged her to step aside when the threats started, when the odds grew too high. "You all right?" he asked finally, his voice rough. Karoline nodded once. "Just tired." But it wasn't tiredness. It was something deeper, something hollow and cold that had started growing inside of the moment Judge Mercer was led away in handcuffs. She had thought that seeing justice served would feel like victory. Instead, it felt unfinished, as if the real battle hadn't even begun. The car turned onto a narrow street behind the courthouse, away from the flashing cameras. Karoline glanced out the window and frowned. A black SUV was parked crookedly along the curb, its engine running. Two men sat inside, their faces hidden behind tinted glass. For a moment, unease prickled the back of her neck. She brushed it off. She was being paranoid. After everything, who could blame her? But as the car slowed at a red light, a sleek motorcycle pulled up alongside them. The rider wore a black helmet, visor down, face obscured. He didn't move. He didn't even glance at them. Just sat there, engine growling low and menacing. Michael noticed it too. His fingers tightened slightly on the seat. "We're being watched," he muttered. Before Karoline could respond, the light changed and their driver, a young man named Evan, hired through a private security firm, accelerated smoothly. The motorcycle didn't follow. Neither did the SUV. But the sense of being hunted stayed with her like a second skin. By nightfall, the news had exploded across every major network. Corrupt judge arrested mid-hearing, the headline screamed. Young lawyer stands tall against legal tyranny. Her phone buzzed nonstop with calls, texts, interview requests. Some were congratulatory. Others, not so much. Buried among the well-wishes were the threats. Anonymous numbers, vicious messages, promises that she would regret embarrassing the wrong people. Karoline stared at the screen in her dark apartment, the glow casting long shadows across the walls. She set the phone down, face down, and closed her eyes. She wasn't afraid for herself. She had made her peace a long time ago with the risks of standing up for what was right. What terrified her now was the possibility that others, the bakery owners, Michael, even Evan the driver, could become collateral damage. The knock at the door was soft but urgent. She rose, every nerve on edge, and peered through the peephole. It was Michael, alone. She let him in quickly, locking the door behind him. "You need to see this," he said, without preamble. He held out a flash drive. Karoline frowned but took it, plugging it into her laptop. A video file loaded, grainy security footage, time-stamped from earlier that day. It showed Judge Mercer in his chambers, pacing furiously, yelling into a phone. "Can't hold it off any longer," he was saying, voice distorted but recognizable. "They're sniffing around. She's digging too deep." A pause. Then the judge's voice dropped into something almost desperate. "I did what you asked. I buried the evidence. I sabotaged her cases. I slandered her reputation. What more do you want from me?" Another long pause. Mercer clutched the edge of his desk, his face a mask of fear. "I'll deal with her, one way or another." The screen froze. Karoline leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. Michael watched her carefully. "Who was he talking to?" she whispered. Michael shook his head. "We don't know. Yet. But it's bigger than just him." The realization settled over her like an icy blanket. Judge Mercer hadn't been a lone wolf. He was a pawn, a disposable one. The real enemy was still out there, still pulling strings in the shadows. And now, she was in their crosshairs. Outside, the storm broke at last, rain lashing against the windows, thunder shaking the glass. Karoline rose to her feet, every fiber of her being screaming that she couldn't stay here, that she couldn't just wait for the next attack. "We have to move," she said. "Now." Michael nodded. "I've got a safe house an hour outside the city. No one knows about it." They gathered only the essentials, a backpack, her laptop, important documents, and slipped out into the night. The drive was tense, silent except for the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Karoline kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, half expecting headlights to appear out of the darkness behind them, but they reached the cabin without incident. It was a small, sturdy place tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and silence. Michael checked every lock, every window, every blind. Only once they were sure they were alone did they relax, slightly. Karoline sank onto the couch, exhaustion dragging at her limbs. She watched the fire crackle on the hearth, letting its warmth chase away some of the cold that had settled inside her. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice small. "How deep does it go?" Michael sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. His face was grim. "Deeper than we thought. Mercer's just the first domino. Taking him down spooked them. They're going to come after you now, hard." Karoline swallowed. Fear curdled in her gut, bitter and unwelcome. But alongside it burned something else. Fiercer, brighter. Resolve. She stood up slowly, the firelight casting her shadow long and tall against the wall. "Then let them come," she said. Michael looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face, proud, fierce. "You're not alone in this," he said. For the first time in days, Karoline smiled back. But deep in the forest, unseen by either of them, a red light blinked once, then disappeared. They had been found. The next move belonged to the enemy, and they would show no mercy. The first sign of danger was a silence, not the kind that lulled or comforted, but the kind that pressed in, thick and unnatural, setting every nerve in Karoline's body on edge. The crackling fire had burned low. throwing long, flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind only a mist that clung to the trees like a shroud. Michael was the first to sense it, too. He was halfway across the living room when he froze, his head tilting slightly, listening. A soft crunch, a footstep on wet gravel. Then another. Karoline met his eyes, reading the confirmation there. They were not alone. Without a word, Michael moved to the fireplace and pulled out a hidden compartment in the stonework, retrieving a small, cold metal object, a pistol heavy and grim. Karoline's hands clenched into fists. She hated violence, hated everything it represented. But tonight was not about hatred. It was about survival. Another footstep, closer now, than the faint scrape of a window latch being tested. Michael motioned silently toward the back door. Karoline grabbed her backpack, slinging it over her shoulder. They moved swiftly, quietly, every sense heightened. But they were too late. The front door exploded inward with a roar. Splinters went flying like shrapnel. Men in black tactical gear stormed inside, weapons drawn, their faces obscured by masks. "Get down!" one of them barked, voice harsh and distorted. Karoline and Michael dug behind the couch as bullets tore through the air, shredding the furniture into tatters. The noise was deafening, a brutal symphony of chaos. Michael fired back twice, quick, controlled shots. One of the attackers went down with a grunt, but the others kept coming. "This way!" Michael shouted, grabbing Karoline's arm and dragging her toward a hidden trapdoor in the floor. They tumbled down into darkness, slamming the door shut above them. The tunnel was narrow and damp, carved long ago as forgotten escape route. They ran blindly, feet slipping on the wet ground, breath ragged in their chests. Behind them, they could hear the attackers ransacking cabin, searching, hunting. The tunnel ended in a dense thicket behind the cabin. They emerged gasping into the night, the forest swallowing them whole. "We can't outrun them forever," Karoline panted. "We don't have to," Michael said grimly, pulling a small radio from his jacket. "Help's coming." He clicked it once, twice. A coded signal, a desperate hope. Minutes later, the night erupted with flashing lights and the roar of engines. Black SUVs barreled down the forest path, doors flying open. Men and women in tactical gear, real agents this time, poured out, surrounding the cabin. The attackers were caught in a vice. Within moments, they were disarmed, forced to their knees, their masks ripped away to reveal familiar faces. Lawyers, businessmen, even a former police chief, all tied back to the same web of corruption Karoline had fought so hard to expose. It was over. At least, this part was. Karoline stood trembling as she watched the arrests unfold, rain soaking her hair, mud clinging to her shoes. Michael stood beside her, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead, but smiling nonetheless. "You did it," he said, voice rough with emotion. "You brought them down." Karoline shook her head slowly. "We did it, all of us." In the days that followed, the full story unraveled like a rotten tapestry. Bribery, blackmail, threats, an entire network of corruption reaching into the highest levels of business and government. Judge Mercer's arrest had been just the beginning. The true enemy had always been bigger, darker, more insidious. Karoline became a symbol, not just a legal triumph, but of something even rarer, unwavering courage in a time of fear. News outlets called her the Lionheart of Justice. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse holding candles and signs that simply read, "Thank you, Karoline." Yet through it all, she stayed humble. She knew how close it had come to ending differently, how easily fear could have won. One evening, about a week after the arrests, Karoline stood alone on the steps of the courthouse where it all began. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating. A small boy approached her hesitantly, clutching a handmade card. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, his jeans patched at the knees, his face smudged with dirt. He held out the card shyly. "Thank you, Miss Karoline," he whispered. Karoline knelt to accept it, her throat tightening painfully. Inside, in childish scrawl, were the words, "You made the bad people go away. Now my daddy says we can stay." Tears blurred her vision as she hugged the boy tightly. In that moment, she understood. The fight had never just been about laws or courtrooms or even victories. It had been about people, about the silent, invisible threads that connected every life, every hope, every dream, and about what it meant to protect those threads, even when it seemed impossible. Behind her, the courthouse door swung open. Michael emerged, waving her inside. The first of many trials was about to begin. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight. Karoline rose slowly, the card clutched against her heart. She smiled at the boy, ruffling his hair. Then she turned toward the future, head high, spirit unbreakable, and walked through the doors of justice once more. The world could be dark, it could be cruel, but as long as there were people willing to stand, to fight, to hope, the darkness would never win. And Karoline Leavitt, with her cross gleaming proudly at her neck, her hands steady, her heart fearless, would be there to light the way.